Hi everyone and welcome to Project Athlon. Before we get started, I'd like to say if you do see me looking down or away from the camera, I have got a little tablet here with a bit of a read on it, just due to the fact that there's a lot of numbers going on in this video and lots of names and stuff to remember, so I will be looking down at this quite regularly, so hopefully it doesn't distract anyone as much as it distracts me, but let's get on with the video. In this series I am going to be looking at the Athlon 3000G and just how well it's performing in 2020. Now, it's not the most cutting edge or up-to-date hardware, but it's a chip that's always intrigued me as to just how well it can perform. So I thought, what better way to start than to actually just go ahead and have a go with the chip itself and see what it's doing. Another great reason to check it is, you know, Ryzen is bigger than ever, and this is literally, I would say, pretty much the cheapest way to get into the AM4 architecture and the AM4 platform and Ryzen architecture, technically, although it's called Athlon. So, you know, I wanted to give that a go and see if this is your entry point, how are you going to find it compared to maybe higher end Ryzen hardware. So we'll have a look and find out with that. Now, the Ryzen 3000G was released in November of 2019. When new, it was well reviewed, filled a very specific niche, being an APU at a very low price point. Nothing from Intel could really compete with the Vega 3 integrated graphics. As a CPU on its own, definitely there's probably some competition to be had, but as that kind of integrated APU solution, there's nothing really around its price that could compete. So for the series, what we're actually going to do is we're going to start with a really basic build where we take a look at the performance of an Athlon kind of in its most basic form. Then in later videos we're going to have a look at the RAM, what effects that has if we change, you know, the sticks, the memory, timing. Then we're going to look at overclocking. We're going to be doing it on the stock cooler, maybe some slightly better coolers to see, you know, how well it performs, and then also what temperatures you can expect, as it's definitely that low end. You'd expect those lower temperatures, nothing to be crazy going on there. Once we do reach the limits of the Vega 3 graphics, we are going to put a discrete GPU in there and just see kind of what the CPU can handle without, you know, completely bottlenecking, you know. So if you started this build as an Athlon build, say it was your first ever PC build, you're comfortable with it, you've saved up that bit of extra cash to put a discrete graphics card in it, what can you put in it without, you know, completely bottlenecking it before you need a new processor as well. So let's start and take a look at the build. So first up, as mentioned, is obviously the Athlon 3000G. Now it's 2 core, 4 threads, AMD APU based on the 14 nanometer processor first gen Zen with built-in Vega 3 graphics. The CPU is clocked at 3.5 GHz and the GPU at 1.1 GHz. Luckily it is unlocked, as we mentioned earlier, so we're going to be doing some overclocking with that, see what improvements we can get out of that. Now it does come with a fan, nothing fancy at this price point though, you know, it's always welcome. A fan that you can just whack on there when you get the machine, build it straight away, not have to worry about cooling solutions like that. So yeah, it's a good little chip altogether. Now I paid £38 for one second hand from a UK second hand retailer, which is a fair price considering you get a warranty. You could probably pick one up slightly cheaper if you're on the second hand market, you know, from private sellers, or if you buy it brand new you're looking at about £10 more, but obviously you will know it's a brand new chip. So I've paired it with a Gigabyte B450M S2H motherboard. Now this was the cheapest B450 motherboard I could find on Amazon at the time. We're not looking for the most expensive board, we're not looking for any particular features of B450, all we want is something to be able to overclock the little chip. And as it is the lowest end chip kind of in the AMD range at the moment, we weren't looking or worrying about, you know, what's going to handle the overclocks. Hopefully anything can pretty much handle an overclock of an Athlon. So we'll see how that goes. Then we've got the RAM. We're going to be starting with a single stick of an 8GB HyperX Fury RAM. Now I'm going to start with it clocked at 2400 MHz. It is clocked up to 3200 with XMP, which we will be using on it, but we're going to start at 2400 megahertz to get that real baseline minimum. Now this cost us just under £30 again on Amazon, which is a fair price. It's not actually that much more expensive than 2400 megahertz kits, so if you can go for that, definitely the higher speed is definitely worth the money. So for storage, I've picked up the cheapest M.2 SSD. It was WD Green 120 gig, currently priced at £16.50 on Amazon, and I'm using an old 500 gig hard drive for games. I've had it lying around for a while, but you can definitely pick up second hand or you know, cheaper hard drives for not very much nowadays. The PSU is actually an error cool integrator, 500 watt 80 plus bronze unit. It's a pretty consistently cheap unit that you can get from a few places online. Main reason I go for this is that it's not kind of sold as generic or anything, so there's some sort of name on it, and as it's sold in quite a few places, gives you that kind of slight confidence in it. Not saying it's great, but for what we're going to be using it for, it's definitely going to be enough. The PSU actually cost me just under £35, but you know, as with this build, it's an Athlon. You could definitely go for something a bit cheaper, something lower wattage. If you're feeling confident, you can maybe go for a less rated PSU, as it is only going to be powering the Athlon. Obviously we're going to be adding a GPU later, so it gives us that kind of expandability to add extra cards to this machine without having to change out the PSU at the same time. So all these parts are going to be put inside a eBuyer Element Gaming MN25 case. It was an eBuyer exclusive, it cost about £20 brand new, comes with a acrylic side panel and a 120mm rear exhaust fan, which is quite nice to see for the price. Unfortunately it has no intakes pretty much anywhere other than for the PSU, which is nice to see, but that does mean that thermal performance inside the case is probably going to be worse than what you could expect on some slightly better cases, so it's something to bear in mind. But it was really cheap. It kind of fits the idea of the build in that we're going for a really cheap build here, kind of base level what you can expect. So for this experience, it's going to be more than enough. So all in, this build cost me less than £200. That's including the price of the hard drive from Amazon. Now personally, I think that's a pretty good price for a PC that you're going to build yourself. Considering it's supposedly going to be able to run some games, you know, even better. Obviously if you were building this yourself, you might want to look in the second-hand market, but for me it was just a matter of getting these parts together and getting it built. If you've got the time to wait, definitely more bargains can be had on the second-hand market. Now looking at performance, obviously we're going to look at benchmarks, but quick note in terms of day-to-day performance on Windows, it's totally fine. You've got the SSD in there. As much as it's a really cheap DRAM-less SSD, it's still an SSD, so if you're clicking around in Windows, you're going to be totally fine. Browsing the web, everything like that, it's a completely fine PC. Now getting on to the kind of performance benchmarks, the first one we tested is Cinebench R20. The 3000G scored an average of 878. Looking at some online sources, relatively close to an i5 2500K or a FX 6300. Now, not great CPUs to be comparing to in 2020, but for the budget and considering that we get that relatively good iGPU, I thought it could be a much worse story, so we're quite happy with that as a baseline. For 3D Mark 10, I used the Night Raid benchmark. Now this benchmark is advertised as for APUs, and so it's supposed to be a bit less intensive. Even so, the Athlon did actually struggle here, and we came up with a score of 4601. Not a great score, but a baseline for us to start with nonetheless. Immediately when running the benchmark, it became clear that the Vega 3 graphics are the limiting factor here, not the CPU itself. So we'll see how that carries on with the rest of the benchmarks. Next up is World of Tanks Encore. This benchmark tool for World of Tanks allows us to get consistent scores, unlike online matches where we may see variances game to game. So we kept the settings on minimum, which actually renders everything at 1366 by 768. So here we got a first score of 28,030. Visually it's very smooth, however the details aren't great. But if all someone wants to do is play the game, then this is definitely going to be more than playable. So let's take a step back in time now and go back to 2008 and look at Far Cry 2. So I wanted to include this game as I hoped its age would help the 3000G perform well, and maybe show a good use case for what you'd be buying with this chip, maybe the kind of era of games you're going to be looking to play. And luckily it has a built-in benchmark tool, which does make life easier. So I set all the settings to the highest and the resolution to 1080p, and we were still able to get an average of 33 FPS with a minimum of 19. Although not amazing, this does show just how well it can cope with older titles, and hopefully, you know, that FPS could be brought up to 60 with some adjustments in the settings. Sticking with older games but coming forward a few years, we've got 2013's Battlefield 4, one of my favourite games in the Battlefield series and shooters in general, so I thought we'd give this one a try. So for this I had the settings on lowest with the resolution set to 720p. Benchmarking the first level, we managed to get 52 FPS average and a minimum of 30. This is a surprisingly good experience in all honesty when you're playing, and I was a little bit shocked. I didn't think it'd run quite this well, but quite happy that it did, and we'll see what improvements we get later on, but a really good base to start with there for Battlefield 4. Now, bringing all this kind of, I'm quite surprised, to an end, we've got Call of Duty Warzone. Now I had it set to 720p with the lowest settings, and I only benchmark using the training course, which is obviously going to be a lot less intensive than the actual games. Even so, only able to get an average of 26 FPS and a minimum of 18, which is just not really playable. But the average being so close to 30 did give me hope that we can maybe improve that later down the line. See, can we at least top it over 30 to make it somewhat playable in terms of if you just want to casually play, obviously not competitively, but just a real casual gameplay experience. So there we have it, the first set of results for Project Athlon. I think we have a good starting point, and I hope you guys understand why I've chosen the games I've chosen in terms of age and their graphical needs. Straight away we can see that the limiting factor is going to be those Vega 3 graphics, so it's going to be interesting how much we can get out of them with an overclock and with RAM, etc., before we do need to move on to a discrete GPU to see any more gains. So there we have it for part 1 of the series, and we've got our baseline scores for the Athlon, which we'll be comparing to obviously throughout the series. Let me know what you guys thought of how the chip performed. I myself was quite surprised, even given the research into it, of just how capable a little chip it is. If you're looking forward to the rest of the series, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video if you enjoyed it, and comment down below as well with any questions or any of your thoughts on the Athlon. Thanks ever so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in part 2.